On a Wednesday afternoon on January 12, 2022, in Tullamore, County Offaly, Ireland. It's cold but sunny, the kind of day where you convince yourself to get outside, to move, to breathe in the fresh air before the winter darkness settles in early. By 2:30 p.m., Ashling Murphy has already put in a full day's work. She's a primary school teacher at Scoil Noir-Crimecase in Douro, and she's just finished her shift. The school's CCTV captures her at 2:37. Walking to her car in the parking lot, her movements casual. She drives her red Seat Cordoba along the N52, heading toward the Dangen Road car park near the Grand Canal. It's a route she knows well. The canal towpath is popular with locals, walkers, joggers, families with dogs. It's the kind of place where you'd wave to neighbors, where you'd feel safe in the middle of the day. Ashling parks her car and sets out on foot. But at approximately 3:20 p.m., as Ashling walks alone along that canal towpath, someone else is there too. Someone who's been following women all afternoon. To understand what was lost that day, you need to know who Ashling Murphy was. She was born on July 6, 1998, the youngest of 3 children. She grew up near Blueball, a townland just southwest of Tullamore, with her parents, Ray and Kathleen, her older sister Amy, and her brother Cathal. Music ran through the Murphy family like a river. From 2011 to 2017, Ashling attended Sacred Heart School, a Catholic girls' secondary school in Tullamore. Then she went to Mary Immaculate College in Limerick to study teaching. In October 2021, just 3 months before her death, she graduated with her Bachelor of Education degree. She played camogie for the Kilcormac and represented her college at competitive level. She was active, engaged with her community, beloved by those who knew her. And she was in love. At 23 years old, Ashling Murphy has her whole life stretching out before her. She's recently graduated with a teaching degree. She's been with her boyfriend Ryan Casey for over 5 years. Ashling and Ryan Casey met when they were 15 at a local rugby club disco. It's one of those origin stories that sounds almost too wholesome to be real. 2 teenagers in a small Irish town, finding each other young and holding on. They talked about marriage. They talked about starting a family. They talked about the ordinary, beautiful things that young couples talk about when they believe they have time. But on January 12, 2022, all of that grief still lay ahead. Unimaginable. The Grand Canal towpath near Tullamore is not a remote location. It's not the kind of place where you'd expect something terrible to happen. People go there to clear their heads, to exercise, to enjoy a bit of nature without straying far from town. On this particular Wednesday afternoon, 2 other women were out running along the same stretch of towpath, Jenna Stack and her friend Eilif Marin. As they ran, Jenna noticed something odd. A bicycle lying in the hedgerow. A Falcon Storm mountain bike with distinctive green forks. It seemed out of place, a nice bike just discarded on the bank like someone had dropped it in a hurry. Jenna stopped for a moment, then kept running. A few meters further along the path, she heard a sound, loud rustling from the thick hedgerow beside them. Jenna and Eilif stopped. Eilif called out. No response, just more rustling, violent and frantic. They moved closer and looked down into the ravine below the towpath. What they saw would haunt them. Ashling Murphy was in the briars and thorns at the bottom of the steep embankment. A man was on top of her. She was fighting, kicking out hard, struggling with everything she had. The man looked up at them. He seemed angry that he'd been interrupted. Jenna and Eilif screamed. They called emergency services immediately, but by the time help arrived, it was already too late. Ashling Murphy had been stabbed 11 times in the right side of her neck. 11 times. The blade had slashed her once with its edge, and the repeated stab wounds caused acute blood loss. Her heart stopped there on the banks of the Grand Canal, in the middle of the afternoon, in a place where she should have been safe. The man fled the scene, leaving the bicycle behind. He crossed a field and disappeared. In the immediate aftermath of Ashling Murphy's murder, the Garda, Ireland's national police force, launched a massive investigation. They knew they were racing against time. The person who did this was out there, somewhere, possibly already trying to cover his tracks. Within hours, they identified a suspect, a local man who seemed to fit the description who had been seen in the area. They arrested him. They questioned him. For a brief moment, it seemed like the case might be solved quickly. But then, the forensic evidence came back. The DNA found on the bicycle left at the scene didn't match the suspect. Not even close. CCTV footage confirmed his alibi. He couldn't have been near the canal at the time Ashling was killed. They had the wrong man. The Gardaí released an urgent public statement saying the suspect was no longer considered connected to the case. They were essentially starting over, and they needed the public to know it. It was a setback, a significant one, because somewhere out there, the real killer was watching all of this unfold, and he was already injured. On January 13th, less than 24 hours after Ashling's murder, a man called for an ambulance at his parents' home on Armagh Road in Crumlin, South Dublin. He claimed he'd been stabbed the previous evening in Blanchardstown, a suburb on the other side of the city. His name was Jozef Puska. He was 31 years old, originally from Slovakia, and he'd been living in Ireland since 2015 with his wife and 5 children. When Gardaí arrived at St. James Hospital with the ambulance, they had no reason to connect him to Ashling Murphy's murder. He was being treated as the victim of an assault in an entirely different part of the country. But as detectives from Blanchardstown interviewed him, as they looked at his injuries, as they started to piece together his story, something didn't add up. On January 14th, 2022, 2 days after Ashling Murphy's body was found, Jozef Puska was still in St. James's Hospital, recovering from what he claimed were stab wounds inflicted by an unknown attacker. Detective Garda Brian Farrell was present in the hospital ward, along with an interpreter. Puska was on pain medication. He'd had surgery the night before, but he was conscious, he was coherent, and he started talking. What he said would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against him. According to Detective Farrell's testimony, Puska made a series of admissions. He described following Ashling. He demonstrated how he put his finger to his lips, telling her to be quiet. He said, "I cut her neck." She panicked. I panic, and then it happened. He asked, "Will I go for 10 years?" And in another moment, he allegedly said something even more direct. "I am the murderer." But Puska remained in the hospital for several more days. And when he was finally released on January 18th and arrested and brought to Tullamore Garda Station for formal questioning, he changed his story completely. Over the course of 5 interviews, he performed what the judge would later describe as a volte-face. He denied any involvement in Ashling's death. He denied knowing anything about it. Meanwhile, forensic scientists at Forensic Science Ireland were working urgently, out of hours, around the clock, to process a massive volume of evidence from the crime scene. They found male-specific DNA under Ashling's fingernails, a Y DNA profile. When they compared it to Puska's DNA, it was a match. The probability that it belonged to someone else? 1 in 14,000. They also found DNA and fingerprints on the bicycle left at the scene. It belonged to Jozef Puska. Ashling had fought back. She had fought so hard that she left forensic evidence on her killer, evidence that would eventually convict him. In his final interview, the Gardaí used special powers under the Criminal Justice Act that allowed juries to draw inferences when a suspect refuses to explain certain facts. They asked him directly, "How do you explain the presence of your bicycle at the crime scene? How do you explain the presence of your DNA under Ashling Murphy's fingernails?" Puska refused to answer. He was given multiple opportunities to provide any explanation he might later rely on in court. He stayed silent. On January 19th, 2022, 1 week after Ashling's body was found, Jozef Puska was formally charged with her murder. The trial of Jozef Puska began on October 17th, 2023, nearly 2 years after Ashling Murphy's murder. The Central Criminal Court in Dublin was packed. Ashling's parents, Ray and Kathleen, were there. Her sister Amy, her brother Cathal, and her longtime boyfriend Ryan Casey sat in the courtroom, holding each other up through the ordeal. The prosecution, led by Anne-Marie Lawlor SC, presented a devastating case. They had the hospital admissions, they had the DNA evidence, they had CCTV footage showing Puska in the area on the day of the murder. They had witness testimony from Jenna Stack and Awif Moran, who described seeing Ashling fighting for her life. And they had the evidence that earlier that same afternoon, Puska had been following other women along the canal. He'd been stalking potential victims. Ashling was not his first target that day. She was simply the one he managed to isolate. The defense tried to argue that Puska's hospital admissions might have been affected by pain medication, by the unfamiliar environment, by confusion after surgery. A medical expert raised concerns about whether Puska had full capacity when he made those statements. But the prosecution pointed out that an interpreter had been present. There was no evidence of confusion or disorientation in the moment. The admissions were detailed, specific, consistent with the physical evidence. And then there was Puska's own testimony. He took the stand and told a story that defied belief. He claimed he'd been attacked by an unknown man wearing a face mask. He said he saw the same masked man attack Ashling, that he tried to help her and then fled the scene, injured and afraid, hiding in a ditch for hours. The judge, Mr. Justice Tony Hunt, would later describe Puska's testimony as nonsensical carry-on. He told the jury that the evidence was overwhelmingly one-sided and that it would be improper to create an artificial balance where none existed. On November 9, 2023, after deliberating for just over a day, the jury of 9 men and 3 women returned with an unanimous verdict: guilty. As the word was read aloud, Ashling's mother Kathleen held up a framed photograph of her daughter. The family wept. Members of the jury were in tears. Józef Puska put his hands over his face and bowed his head. On November 17, 2023, Mr. Justice Tony Hunt sentenced Puska to the mandatory life sentence for murder in Ireland. But the judge took an unusual step. He publicly criticized Ireland's sentencing restrictions, expressing his view that judges should have the power, as they do in other jurisdictions, to set minimum terms for life sentences. Under current Irish law, Puska would be eligible for parole in 12 years. 12 years for a life stolen in broad daylight. The conviction of Józef Puska should have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. Because in the immediate aftermath of the murder, while investigators were working to build their case, members of Puska's own family were working to destroy evidence. On the night of January 12, 2022, the same day as the murder, Puska returned to the house he shared in Mucklog, near Tullamore, with his wife Lucia, his 2 brothers, and their families. He arrived with visible injuries. He was shaking, bleeding from the head, covered in scratches. An acquaintance who gave him a lift to the house later testified that Puska looked nearly blue and was clearly in distress. Inside that house, Puska admitted to his brothers what he had done. He told them he had killed or seriously injured a woman with a knife. His brothers, Marek and Lubomir Puska Jr., said nothing to the Garda investigating the murder. When they gave witness statements, they withheld crucial information that could have aided the investigation in its earliest, most critical hours. And Puska's wife Lucia, along with his brothers' wives, Josefina Grunzova and Viera Gaziova, took the clothes he'd been wearing that day, blood-stained evidence, and burned them in the fireplace. By the time Puska left for his parents' house in Dublin later that night, he'd shaved his beard and changed his clothing. The CCTV footage from his arrival in Crumlin shows him clean-shaven, wearing different clothes than he had on earlier in the day. The next morning, when the ambulance arrived to take him to the hospital, the physical evidence of the crime had been systematically destroyed. In June 2025, after a trial that lasted weeks, all 4 family members were convicted. Marek and Lubomir Puska Jr. were found guilty of withholding information. Josefina Grunzova and Viera Gaziova were found guilty of burning evidence to impede the prosecution. Lucia, Puska's wife, had already pleaded guilty in pre-trial hearings. In October 2025, they were sentenced to between 20 months and 2.5 years in prison. At the sentencing hearing, Ashling's father, Ray Murphy, stood in the courtroom and spoke about the pink plastic fiddle, the one his daughter had cherished since she was a toddler, the one she'd planned to pass down to her own children. It remained in her bedroom, he said, frozen in time. He told the court that the family's small consolation, that Puska now rots in prison, isolated and alone, would have been robbed from them if these 5 people had succeeded in hiding his guilt. Ashling's sister Amy spoke about playing music with her sister, about the special bond they'd shared, about how music would never be the same without Ashling. And Ryan Casey, standing in that courtroom, spoke directly to Józef Puska. He said, "Because of you, I lost my Ashling. I have lost everything I have ever wanted in life. I will never get to marry my soulmate or see her smile again." He called Puska the epitome of pure evil. In the aftermath of Ashling Murphy's murder, something shifted in Ireland. Vigils were held across the country, in Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway, Belfast. Vigils were held in London, in New York, in Melbourne, in Vancouver. Women shared their stories of harassment, of fear, of violence. They spoke about the daily calculations they make, which routes to avoid, what time to be home by, who to text when they're walking alone. The murder forced a national conversation about women's safety that could no longer be ignored. Ireland's Taoiseach, Michael Martin, promised a zero-tolerance approach to violence against women. The government published a 5-year strategy to tackle domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence. New legislation was introduced, criminal offenses for stalking, for non-fatal strangulation. But activists pointed out that this was the third such strategy since 2010, and the numbers kept climbing. Since 1996, Women's Aid Ireland has kept a record of violent deaths of women in the country. By the time of Ashling's murder, 244 women had been killed. In the 3 years since Ashling's death, 28 more women have lost their lives to male violence. Their names deserve to be remembered too: Sandra Boyd, Mary Bergen, Ruth Lose, Louise Mucknell, Lisa Thompson, Larissa Serban, Miriam Burns, Lisa Cash, Ioana Mihaela Pacala, Emma McCrory, Sharon Crean, Bruna Fonseca, Maud Coffey, Gaila Ibram, Angela Canavan, Catherine Henry, Anna Mooney, Deepa Dinamani, Lorna Woodnut Kearney, Claire Collins, Patricia Muckian, Deanna Walsh, Vanessa O'Colligan, Sierra Naughton, Mirjana Papp, Paula Canty, Annie Heineman, Gillian Curran. May their soul rest in peace. Ashling Murphy did everything right. She went for a walk in the middle of the day, in a familiar place. She fought back with everything she had. She left evidence on her killer that eventually brought him to justice. But she still died. And that's the truth that won't let go. Because if Ashling Murphy, a beloved teacher, a talented musician, a woman who lived her short life to the full, wasn't safe on a Wednesday afternoon along a canal path in her hometown, then who is? Thanks for watching. If you're interested in real investigations, shocking cases, and justice served, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us as we explore more true crime stories.